welcome everybody. My name is Steve Call, and I'm the president of the New America Foundation, where you are now. Welcome. And it's my pleasure to lead the conversation initially with my friend and New America board member, Zach Karabell, who's brought forward this important book about China and the United States. Just to give you just a little bit of a sense of how we're going to proceed, I think Zach and I will talk. I'll just interview him informally for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. When that time arrives, please do wait for the microphone to reach you. Please be aware that we're streaming this live. This is essentially a broadcast environment, so identify yourselves. Don't say anything you don't want the world to hear, and please don't make any speeches. Just ask questions. And we'll look forward to that. And at the end, you'll have an opportunity to reward Zach for all of his hard work by actually purchasing his book outside and having him sign a copy. It is, I believe, the beginning of the Christmas season, and we all have a duty to stimulate the economy and get our shopping done early. And
books have the advantage of actually being made in America. So.
Yes, there you go. So I think we'll have to weave into this conversation, Zach, a lot of the larger themes of the book, and I don't want to step on any of them, but I do want to kind of maybe start a little bit in the middle, in a sense, because one of your findings in this book, and I think one of the important ideas that you bring forward from lots of different angles, involves the interdependence of the emerging relationship between the United States and China. And of course, we've heard a lot about the role of banker and borrower, especially in the context of the current financial crisis. But I think one of the points you're making is that it's a much richer, more complicated, more fused relationship than just banker and borrower. So I want to ask a related question about that, which is, to what extent did the government of China understand the structure of the relationship that started to accumulate during the last 10 or 15 years? To what extent were they self-conscious about it, trying to direct it? Because we know that we were not especially
right.
That way. Did they have councils in which they sort of correctly understood what was accumulating under their feet?
It's a good question. What I write about in the book is that history sort of creeps up on you. Occasionally it happens with great fanfare and dramatic moments, and you have that aha of, I'm at an inflection point and this is meaningful. But more often than not, things sort of happen and then you turn around and you realize that things have changed in a really substantive fashion. And in that respect, it's unlikely that people woke up in 1492 in Florence and went, the Renaissance. So what you had in China was, as a result of one real inflection point, which was the revolt or protest at Tiananmen Square and the suppression, the bloody suppression in June of 1989, you had a very clear decision on the part of the Chinese leadership, and in many ways orchestrated by Deng Xiaoping, that the future arc of Chinese society would not follow what was happening in the then Soviet Union, wouldn't follow what then, of course, unfolded in Eastern Europe in the fall of '89, but instead would follow a very different pattern, which is no political reform and hypercharged economic reform. And that was very conscious. And with that conscious decision continued what had been baby steps in the 1980s, which is, if you're going to undertake hypercharged economic reform and you're China in 1989, your major global reference point is going to be the center of economic reform or economic activity globally, i.e. the United States. And so insofar as that's a very clear policy, a domestic Chinese policy, its ramifications are very clearly to then turn to and look to the United States for all sorts of things. At one point, I think in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping said something like, wouldn't it be great if one day we could have like $5 billion of foreign investment in the country? By the late 1990s, that's running at $50, $60, $70 billion a year. And I'm not even talking about trillions of dollars of reserves. I mean, if Deng Xiaoping had been shown in 1989 what the current reality is, I'm sure he would have been astonished as well. But there is a very clear decision to woo, attract, obtain American capital, American expertise, American investment, and the kind of the intellectual property of American companies, not the way we think about it from we're just going to copy a bunch of DVDs and Nike sneakers, but the intellectual property in the form of management know-how, managerial techniques, how to slowly reform the Chinese banking system at a time when the U.S. banking system was seen as a viable model. As we now know, in the past 2 years, it really shouldn't have been the Chinese banking system we were concerned about. But that is a very clear decision throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. And China allows for a degree of porousness to American capital and ideas and investment that's rather extraordinary, given that it remained a closed economic system all throughout this time. So China is acutely aware of the United States, acutely aware of the close relationship, of wanting brands, of wanting foreign brands or better-made products that often were the product of American and, to some degree, multinational companies generating them. And I think in that sense you have to think of the parallel being, as China is emerging in its own particular domestic path in a much more hybrid economy that's somewhat of a market economy, it's very aware of the dominant kid on the block, which is the United States. The dominant kid on the block, the United States, is much less attuned to the changes in the landscape until those changes reached a certain scale, which they did in the past few years, and then it's unavoidable. And now Americans are suddenly aware and waking up to the reality of China as having emerged as a substantial economic superpower globally.
So one of the pieces of current wisdom is that the relationship between the United States and China is unbalanced and needs to be rebalanced in order to create conditions for global economic growth that is sustainable. You know, obviously, it's unbalanced in a mathematical sense. But do you think that in a geoeconomic, strategic sense that A, the Chinese think the relationship is profoundly unbalanced and needs to be rebalanced, and B, do you also think that it is profoundly unbalanced and needs to be rebalanced? And if so, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think there's clearly a global consensus, whether it's finance ministers meeting in Pittsburgh or London or the various discussions among the G20, the G20 global economies. It's certainly true that if you listen to Chinese officials from the Premier Wen Jiabao on down, if you listen to American officials from Tim Geithner to Larry Summers to Obama, if you listen to Europeans, everyone agrees that there are global imbalances. I happen to feel that that's a very problematic and probably wrong way of looking at what's going on globally. You know, everyone always talks about global imbalances, but no one ever does anything about them. But it's also true that the word imbalance, and I don't mean to be semantic here, but the word imbalance suggests that there's this thing called a balanced global economy that we just kind of got away from without being fully aware of it, and now we're paying the price. And so the goal is to restore this thing called a balanced global economy. And I suppose if you listen to what people say, their notion of a balanced global economy is that there's some even relationship between the amount that any particular nation state consumes and the amount that it produces. And that has to be more or less equivalent within each national boundary, or else you create these global distortions. And so the current wisdom is Americans over-consumed and under-saved, and China over-saved and under-consumed, and that in order to restore quote-unquote balance, Americans have to save more and consume less, and Chinese have to consume more domestically and save less. And that in so doing, these capital accounts, which are out of whack, i.e. out of whack in that the U.S. has a hugely negative one and China has a hugely positive one, will come more like this. And then I guess you'll have an equilibrium that's more tenable. The problem with that framework is, one, I think it's a huge stretch to pawn off the problems of the past year and a half in the global economy on these structural realities. That doesn't mean that a lot of people who were saying, because look, a lot of people have been saying that this is a problem for many years. So a crisis happens. Lehman blows up, derivatives get out of whack, the subprime mortgage market in the United States collapses, and the sort of global financial system teeters on the brink. And a lot of people have been saying for years, hey, there's all these problems of development, and particularly between the bilateral economic relationship between China and the United States. And so you take proximate disaster and you add what you were warning was proximate cause, and you say, you see, this is the result. I was warning this all the time. I feel that's a little bit like somebody who for years, your friend in California who calls you up and goes, the big one's going to hit. It's going to hit. My computer, I've got that whole seismic graph. I'm logged onto the National Seismic Center, and I'm charting activity, and I'm telling you, it's any day now. The tremors are showing it. And like one night, a small meteor hits Southern California, and your friend calls up and he says, "You see?" So there's a real.
But the case for there really being imbalance, as I understand it, I may not understand it perfectly, or even approximately, is that the surplus dollar countries, China notable among them, but not alone, having learned the wrong lessons from the '97 Asian crisis and the vulnerability of not having dollar reserves, then put themselves in a position of chasing return. And we were, in the West, in the banking system, in the shadow banking system, basically going to offer an answer to the problem of all of these dollar surpluses. So that it's essentially the mess we made in our banking system was partly a failure of our regulatory political economy, but partly a structural consequences of too much liquidity with no place to go.
Right, and I would argue that there was a lot of liquidity globally, and there clearly was a lot of it that didn't have places to go, but that was much more a product of wealth being unlocked in the developed world than it was necessarily a product of
the
these
developed
imbalances.
world or the developing world?
The developing world.
Right.
And that happened much more quickly and more rapidly than people expected. So there was a lot of wealth creation, some of it because of the rising price of oil in the Gulf region, some of it because of this incredible growth of global trade. I mean, it wasn't just China exporting cheap stuff to the United States. There was a real growth of global trade, and particularly after 2000, 2001. Symbolically, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, helped spur that. But one of the adjuncts of this kind of globalization of capital was that there was a lot more activity, and there was a lot more liquidity, and there's a lot more wealth. I don't think anyone could deny that.
So that's not a China-U.S. story.
No, what is a China-U.S. story is that, and this is kind of obvious but seems to be less obvious in the way we talk about it, that this relationship of China lending and us borrowing right now is really only possible because we exported the money to China in the first place. It's not as if the Chinese got rich somehow and we had a crisis and we turned to them as a banker and then they lent us money. The money that's being, as it were, lent was money that originated from U.S. consumption activity of China's produced goods. Because China, for most of the past 10 years, has actually had either had flat trade with the rest of the world, or actually has had something of a trade deficit with a lot of the rest of the world. China's had a trade deficit with Japan. It had one with Korea. Until 2007, it had one with Germany, and that's because a lot of these countries were exporting high-end, either industrial goods or higher-end steel that China itself wasn't producing. So China was actually consuming a lot of these global products, not exporting them. It was exporting them to America. Let me just, on the point about the imbalance thing is that not only has there never been a balance that you could say, let's return to, but there is this circularity of capital that then kind of flows into China, flows back to the United States. And it's also true that a lot of the economic activity in China is the product of American companies doing business in China, which gets completely lost by any kind of official statistics, because all that trade data or capital data does is, a dollar out to dollar out, and a dollar in is a dollar in, and a good out is a good out, and a good that comes into Long Beach is an import. It doesn't account for who makes it, how it's made, where it's sourced. None of that can show up on officials.
So it seems like the implication of your argument is that in thinking about where the United States is now and how to evaluate the last couple of years, not only is it wrong to sort of fob off the events of the last couple of years onto this narrative of imbalances between the U.S. and China, but that another implication is that since there isn't a narrative of imbalance that is profoundly the right frame, then the challenge is to actually use the liquidity productively if you're in the United States, rather than pouring it into bad banking and bad housing.
And there is definitely a narrative of shifting balances, unquestionably. I mean, the story of this relationship for the past 20 years is the emergence of China as a viable and vibrant economic force to be dealt with globally, along with the United States, to the point where, at any point in the past 4 or 5 years, close to half of the world's economic growth and activity has been accounted for by the United States and China. The Chinese portion has increased dramatically. The U.S. portion has begun to decrease less dramatically. But that the two together act as a kind of economic engine for global activity, much the way the United States alone acted as an engine for economic activity between 1945 and the early 1960s.
Okay, so that's a good transition to a second sort of piece of received wisdom that would be good to maybe poke at or explore how you see it. The cover of The Economist week before last, or last week, had the image of Tony Blair trying to wake up sleeping Europe.
Right.
And the notion was that was playing off of this piece of wisdom that looking out over the next 20 years, thinking about the global economy, thinking about global strategy and power, that it's all about the G2 now, about the United States and China. And the Economist leader wanted to make the case that, of course, as a mathematical matter, the European economy is larger than either of the other two, and that if Europe could only organize itself to act cohesively, there could be a third leg of the stool, and so on. Now, a related question. Is this framework sudden emergence of the idea that the course of cooperation and negotiation between the United States and China will be central, correct in your view? And if it sort of excludes the G20 and India, or risks doing so. So what's the relationship between the G2 and the G20 looking out over the next 20 years?
So an interesting analogy for what's going on between China and the United States, in my view, is in fact the European Union. And in some sense, I'm suggesting that what's happening between China and the U.S., a potential pathway for what's happening, is that the two economies are becoming like the EU without anybody meaning to, knowing it, or wanting it. It's sort of like the European Union without any Treaty of Rome, without any intent on the part of its individual countries to cede sovereignty to some transnational entity. And that what's happening between the Chinese and the U.S. economies is that it's becoming a system that's essentially transcending the national control of either government. I'm not going to comment as much about the role of kind of the European Union in this, because I'm not sure I have a lot to say about it other than the reality of the EU is that it's very large, but it isn't exerting the kind of locus of dynamism on global trade, on global capital flows, any more than Japan currently is, even though Japan remains the second or third largest single national economy by size in the world. And so size alone doesn't dictate influence. And I think, by the way, that's an extremely important reality and or warning for the United States, which is just because we have the world's largest economy, $14 trillion, give or take, in a global economy of $45 trillion, give or take, does not mean that size, or even that affluence, necessarily translates into power and influence. And Japan, I think, is a sobering reminder of that, which is you can be very large, a lot of economic size, and have less impact than your size would suggest. And the same is clearly true of the European Union. And whether that's because their companies don't export as much, or the particular dynamics of the European social safety net, which means a lot of that money, in spite of this union, it stays within itself.
So go back to the sovereignty observation about the United States and China. Very, very important. What aspects, unintended consequences of this economic interdependence today manifest themselves as a loss of sovereignty in some political science sense in the United States? And then what aspects so manifest themselves in China.
Right, so two that are, I think, notable in the United States. One is, it is striking about the current crisis that there has been so little trade antagonism manifesting itself in politics. There's been plenty of trade antagonism manifesting itself in rhetoric, right? Unions are very upset about the continual perception of Chinese labor and systems undermining the American workforce. There certainly have been many questions raised about China's currency policy and whether it creates unfair trade advantages. There has been, other than that moment a few weeks ago with tire tariffs, which was briefly rhetorically reciprocated with the threat of chicken feet tariffs on the part of China. Now, I don't know about you. I don't think tires and chicken feet will actually determine the warp and woof of material life in the Western world in the coming years. I could be wrong about that, but for the time being, tires and chicken feet strike me as a pretty low indication of trade wars, not a particularly high one. Any other global crisis like the financial crisis has been accompanied by lots and lots of real negative action about trade. And I think part of it's that, every time somebody thinks about doing something on, like Schumer and Lindsey Graham, and they're continually threatened 27% tariff if China doesn't revalue its currency, you come up against the fact that there's no tariff you can create that doesn't hurt you as much as it hurts the other person. And even this tire example, I mean, one of the groups that was so upset about the tire trade was tire workers in Ohio working for Goodyear, because the whole economics of the way tires are produced and sold in the United States by American companies has become intimately intertwined with producing in China or sourcing partly in China or selling tires to China, for that matter. The other thing is central banks and interest rates, right? One of the things basically governments do is they have a military, and they print money. And to some degree try to set the value of that money, even if there's free-floating currencies. A few years ago, Alan Greenspan talked about this conundrum of why it was that the Fed was raising and lowering interest rates, and that the global interest rate for money, would kind of a proxy, would be the 10-year Treasury note. Why it was that rate basically didn't move. So between 2001 and 2009, the Fed has gone from basically 0% interest rates to 5.5%. And the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury note has remained almost entirely in a band of about 3.5% to 4.5% throughout that time. A couple weeks here and there fluctuated up to 5, fluctuated below 3. But for the most part, the price of money globally has been totally separate from central bank policy. And I think one of the reasons for that conundrum is you have an economic system here that is functioning based on capital pricing, based on global, not capital pricing based on what our central bank does. And that's very disconcerting, in terms of the ability of the central bank to actually determine the interest rates on its own money.
And for the
Chinese side, there's a couple of things. One, China continues to say, whenever pressed by the G20 or the G2, to do more about stabilizing the global system or to be more of an active player in the global economic system. Chinese officials until recently have always said, look, we're an incredibly poor country. For all the stellar economic growth for 20 years, there's still 800 million people living on rice farms. We have incredible rural poverty. We have an immature financial system. We're a poor country on a per capita and even an aggregate basis. And our focus has to be on attending to our own domestic economy, not this global system, which we're not a big enough player in. So first of all, what's happened the past year has kind of showed to the Chinese authorities that one, they're not as poor as they say. And two, having tethered themselves to a global economic system for their own enrichment, they're now tethered to it, which means they can't just snap their fingers and go, we want to detach from the dollar. I mean, the Chinese can say all they want. We don't like being pegged to the dollar. We're worried that all of our trillions of dollars of holdings, which are denominated in dollars, are going to lose value if the dollar loses value. Great. They can buy up half the world's gold supply, all the world's copper supply, try to stockpile oil, try to stockpile iron ore, and 6 weeks later they're still generating, $35 billion a month in excess capital that they have nothing they can do with except buy treasuries. So their sovereignty, right, their desire to be total masters of the value of their budget is largely dependent on whether or not the American economy does well, doesn't, and even more whether or not global currency traders affix a certain value to the dollar based on what's going on. The other aspect has to do with the domestic. China would love the world to basically do what it claims it does to the rest of the world, which is your domestic policies are your domestic policies. We take no statement on them. And one of the reasons why China has been so successful wooing kind of goodwill in Africa and Latin America is that when it does dealings with a country like Sudan or a country like Bolivia or Venezuela, it says, hey, we will make no statements about your domestic policies whatsoever. But China also then expects the same. And the problem with China being so intimately woven into the global system is it can't really do exactly what it wants to do in Tibet or exactly what it wants to do with the Uyghurs or exactly what it wants to do with the Olympics without the world going, hey, wait a minute, we have an interest here in how your domestic system works.
So one of the, I think, great sources of value in a book like this is that it conceptually challenges where you draw your borders as you go in towards specificity. And so I know that when you make these analogies to the European Union, you're doing so directionally and you're not trying to overdraw them and so forth. But let's just, with that caveat, stay within this conceptual framework, because it's profound to think that the unintended interdependency of two very large economies could, over the course of 5 or 10 or 20 years, change the boundaries of sovereignty. Let's not say undermine sovereignty, but certainly change the equation, because already we cede our sovereignty in a world of global interdependence. But so if we're just directionally, if we're sort of Britain and France in a young European Union where we have a clear understanding of the benefits of our interdependency, but also a clear understanding of our distinct interests, which in this case also includes two different currencies on the global stage.
Right.
So if you look out over the next 20 years then, where does your concept suggest that joint U.S.-Chinese interests in the global economy lie, and where are we truly managing distinct and potentially competitive interests?
Right. So there are, I think, two pathways that are possible. One is that we're Britain and France at an earlier stage in the 20th century, or Britain, France, and Germany, somehow 3 becoming 2. And that there's a slow dance of convergence that's mutually beneficial, certainly filled with potholes and tension and uncertainty along the way.
Hopefully not a world war.
No, post 1945. Right. And that convergence kind of proceeds gradually in a way that does, in fact, suit the needs of both societies. And it really isn't just so simple as certain low-cost production in China has certainly facilitated the ability of U.S. consumers to afford a range of material goods that would not otherwise be affordable if they were produced at the price point that they would necessarily be produced if they were made here. You don't get $50 DVD players made in a factory in the United States because you can't pay workers as little as China does. That's an unsubjective statement that lots of people have very strong subjective feelings about. It's equally true that you wouldn't have had the kind of bottom line growth of a lot of U.S. companies, whether it's Kentucky Fried Chicken or Avon Cosmetics or Procter & Gamble, which had the first billion-dollar brand in China. A lot of the consumer activity in China is brand-oriented toward American companies. And that actually does benefit American society, I argue, more than our statistics would suggest, partly because of the way capital's, where it's placed and how it's tracked, which is all, I think, much less accurate than the reality of it flowing around. And some of it does, in fact, directly benefit the domestic American economy. It keeps a Caterpillar plant open in Mississippi that provides couplings solely for use in earth movers that are made in China and service the industrialization of China. So you have that kind of, and also the fact that, look, oddly enough, if we hadn't exported a lot of our capital to China over the past years, if that $1 trillion that China holds in U.S. treasuries had actually been invested in American markets or in the American housing market, it would have been $500 billion. So in a weird way, it's been a safer haven for our capital invested by China in our treasuries than it might have been if it had been kept within the American economy. So in all these ways, you can imagine ever greater convergence in a way that actually creates a level of economic stability, not without crises. That's pathway 1. Pathway 2, though, is China and the United States are actually Britain and the United States. Except in this case, the United States is playing the role of Great Britain and China is playing the role of the United States. And again, I'm not saying in any way is that pathway clear, right? But we know how that story progressed to the point where after World War II, because Great Britain had spent so much of its time and energy focused on the threat it thought was the real threat, which was Nazi Germany, or before that Imperial Germany, that the real threat to its imperial position turned out to be the United States in 1946, which had the capital, the know-how, and the innovation. So, Great Britain essentially expended its energy, its capital, and its empire over the course of 30 years, fighting a war that it thought was the most important. And that was a real threat. And there could be parallels between the United States focusing on Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iran. Real threats all, but perhaps not the challenge to our way of life that we ascribe to them. And it's not that China challenges our way of life, but faced with a dynamic, innovative competitor, if you don't continue to be equally dynamic and innovative, you risk losing slowly your ability to compete, your ability to be a partner and to be an equal. And at some point, that will have reached a tipping point. I don't suggest we're in any way there, but I do say that when you look back and you look forward, that is certainly as much of a potential pathway as the EU one.
Well, one issue that I thought you would address either as a potential source of cooperation or competition is the question of currency. And so how do you see that? There's so much discourse now about the future of the dollar as a reserve currency, and obviously the unwillingness of China to float its own currency has been one of the sources of this potential periodic crisis. But what do you think the interests really argue for on the two sides?
I think the interests argue for what actually was going on until this year, which is that China was very quietly revaluing its currency. It wasn't doing it quickly. It wasn't doing it explicitly. It wasn't doing it in public. But between 2006 and 2008, China's currency actually did appreciate by about 15 or 16%, and was kind of on a 5 to 8 to 10% a year pathway. So that if it hadn't been for the speed bump, a rather massive speed bump of what happened in the global financial system between September of 2008 and the spring of 2009, you would have been seeing that gradual appreciation, because that was actually determined as a policy by the Chinese government in conjunction with the American government. And to some degree, both governments had learned that if what you want is to harmonize currency policy to achieve some of the mutual domestic aims of both governments. I mean, make no mistake, I'm saying I don't think there are these huge global imbalances the way we conceive, but it's certainly true that the Chinese know that over time they need to have a more vibrant domestic economy with more vibrant domestic consumption in order to achieve the kind of affluence and power and stability they want. Just as the American system knows that there has to be somewhat more savings, although I think that we could get into that. I don't necessarily agree with the thesis about the U.S. But the only way to do that was to do it quietly. That if you make currency a cudgel, with us saying the Chinese should revalue their currency, and by the way, we don't like their human rights either, that's pretty much the last tactic you would use if you actually want them to change their currency policy. And to some degree, the Chinese are falling into that mistake a little bit now, too, where they feel a little more free to criticize the American economic system. Get your own house in order. Don't lecture us, and deal with your own foreclosure problem before you complain about our real estate bubbles in Shanghai. But again, they've kind of learned to be quiet about these things and realize that there is a linked system that requires discussion and coordination at a continual level, continual discussions that are not part of the political process. And note, in all this discussion, I've said very little about Taiwan or military or the politics, and that's deliberate in that I happen to believe that this is a case where the weight of the economic system is slowly but surely overwhelming these other issues. Now, there can be very honest and real disagreement about whether that's true, and you can point to lots of national sentiment in both societies as being a counterpoint to that statement. But my view, which I argue in the book, is that these issues are shaping this relationship more fundamentally than those.
Right, so one last question, then we'll open it to the audience, because it's suggested by what you just said, and I was thinking if I were channeling our colleague Jim Fallows into this conversation, I can hear him saying, as he often does so compellingly, well, there's no one China. There's a Chinese system that is itself as plural and diverse and full of as many interests as the American system. So in the American context, we know most of us have some acquaintance with this debate about China a competitor or not, and what the nature of the debate here that leads to this kind of tentative vote for cooperation, but with a kind of hard-eyed context around that vote. What is the equivalent, do you think, in China in the economic sphere? And what are the range of plausible views that could emerge successfully from Chinese discourse about these subjects?
So one of the best-selling books in China this spring was a book called China is Not Happy, written by 6 authors. And it talks about, it's a very nationalist book, that Chinese government has been sold a bill of goods by the West and by the United States. There's a kind of clear narrative in Chinese society about the West having been a deceitful, rapacious force that's basically kept China humiliated for the past 200 years, and that this is happening today, and that the love affair that China has with all things Western, particularly the westernization of the economy, the market-based economy, is just the latest chapter of that, and that China needs to detach, focus on its own domestic world, and recognize that the West, and the United States in particular, bears it no goodwill. So China certainly has a domestic challenge in that those who are advocating for this kind of currency dialogue or working in a more integrated fashion have a difficult time refuting the nationalist argument and the argument of that's kind of a weak, idealistic, naive position that's going to lead China down a garden path. And that's a real debate within China that sort of outflanks what is still nominally the Communist Party, which has very much created a pathway of, communism with Chinese characteristics or capitalism with Chinese characteristics, that we're going to do this hybrid, sui generis, state-driven market economy system that violates every rule of the IMF and works better than the IMF ever did. And that policy has a hard time countering the nationalist one. I mean, it's a little bit like modernizers in the Middle East have a hard time countering Islamic radicals. Right. They can counter the communists, but they can't counter and that's a problem within China and a real challenge going forward about their pathway. And it's a debate. I don't think the military one is as much a debate. I mean, basically, there's very few voices in China now that are really aggressive about Taiwan, partly because there are very few voices in Taiwan now that are pursuing. I mean, Taiwan had a brief moment about 4 years ago where the party was talking very strongly about asserting Taiwanese independence, and that got refuted domestically.
And the Bush administration came down hard on them, which is part of the evidence of your thesis about the way these things interact. Good. Well, let's turn to your questions.
The microphone.
Please wait for the microphone to come around. There it is. Well, let's start over here, and then we'll come to the other side and go back and forth.
Yeah,
Could you
Chia
please?
Chen,
Yes.
correspondent from Bethesda, Maryland. I have some observation. First is this. You say China have no alternative but by the U.S. Treasury. But the thing is this, and also you have said China is a rich country. Actually, rich is on paper. You look at Chinese rural area. So there are two things. First is, why not U.S. give those U.S. Treasury to China and provide the technology to improve their rural area? In this case, that U.S. have lots of consumer too, because 60% of the Chinese population is in rural area. Second thing is this. I look at your index. I didn't see the Taiwan Relation Act. I think this is a very big undercurrent in your book, so-called Superfusion. U.S. really is conduct two-China policy through the Taiwan Relation Act. So how these two countries to resolve this issue? Thank you.
I'm sorry if that was misconstrued. I didn't say China was rich. I said China's not as poor as it often says, or its own self-conception. I did say that there are 800 million people living in rural poverty. That is a real intensive focus of the Chinese government, and in fact providing 20 to 25 million new jobs a year for that rural populace to move into urban areas, because the policy of the central government and of the regional governments is in fact to create more urbanization, to create more markets. You know, it's a similar pathway as what went on in Europe and the United States in the 19th and 20th century. So it's more to say that there's a lot of poverty, but there certainly is wealth. The technology issue is interesting in that I do advocate in the book, and I have in other places, that the United States would do much better, and American companies would do much better, spending less time trying to protect litigiously intellectual property rights and spend more time trying to sell and disseminate its intellectual property in China, which is essentially what a lot of companies have done, and to continually innovate new intellectual property. So you care less whether someone copies it, because by the time they copy it, you've moved on to the next wave of innovation and products. And that the tendency to try to hold on to this, whether it's technology transfers, partly colored by a certain degree of fear on the part of the defense establishment that anything with a potential dual use at a technological level, if exported to China, could end up as a military challenge. That too is probably, except for extremely specific aspects of nuclear technology, is probably overdrawn, and has in fact led to, I think, some obstacles to what would have been much more productive commerce. Most particularly a few years ago, a large Chinese telecom company called Huawei, which is kind of like the Chinese Cisco meets Qualcomm, tried to buy 3Com, which was a much less successful 1990s telecommunications company, and that was nixed by the United States government on the grounds of sensitive technologies, which made up about 2% of 3Com's business. On the Taiwan U.S., I think, frankly, U.S. policy now is more shaped by what Taiwanese policy is than anything else. And it was, I think, more than symbolic that at the opening of the General Assembly at the end of September, for the first time in, 25, 30 years, the Taiwanese delegation did not make a motion to the General Assembly to give either Taiwan China's seat or its own seat. Or to make a protest that that Communist China was occupying Nationalist China's seat. And I think in many ways Taiwan, so much of its business is actually shipped to Shanghai or the Pearl River Delta, particularly in the semiconductor industry, and that there's much more of a consensus within Taiwan that on the whole it's going to be part of China's orbit willy-nilly, and that a lot of that can be quite constructive.
This side. We'll go to the back.
Albert from Arlington, Virginia, across the river. I agree with you. I think that the imbalance is really a balance in that we give our money to China, China gives us the products. I see a threat to this balance coming down the pike. Recently, if I understand the facts correctly, the growth in Chinese economy has come more and more from their domestic economy rather than their export economy. So my question to you is, as the domestic economy in China continues to grow, at what point, and if you can give me a ballpark guess of what year, you think the domestic economy will be rich enough in China to the point where they no longer need to buy our treasuries?
Right. Current estimates are that sometime around 2030, the aggregate size of the Chinese economy will surpass the aggregate size of the U.S. economy. Although on a per capita basis, it will be decades before there's any kind of comparability. Well into the 21st century, to the point where it becomes difficult to even forecast anything meaningful. By the way, I think all long-range forecasts are meaningless because nothing ever goes the way people think. But it is true that China wants its domestic consumption to rise. It is also true that in the past 2 years, it's actually decreased as a percentage share of its GDP, even as it's increased its aggregate amount, because the amount of state spending has increased. So China's stimulus packages, by the way, China would not be able to spend $600 billion on its own infrastructure stimulus had it not sold goods to the United States to begin with. So its own internal stability is manifestly augmented by this relationship to the U.S. And oddly enough, China's overall trade with the world has increased in the past 3 months to the point where it's now larger than it was except for the last 6 months of 2008, or the middle 6 months. Meaning China is a dramatic winner of the economic fallout of the past year in that it's become an even more potent global trading force than it was before, and it was already pretty potent then. So it's going to be a long time, even if Chinese authorities want more domestic consumption, and there is more domestic consumption as several hundred million middle-class people spend more and have more to spend, and as this money circulates back, it is still an economy often fueled by state spending in a way that disturbs Western economists but clearly works. And it is also an economy still fueled by huge amounts of trade, even as the government wishes that the export model was less prominently part of the economy, but is likely to remain a very prominent part. And by the way, exports remain a huge portion of the U.S. economy. The confusion is we export a lot with fewer and fewer people making those exports. And we produce a lot in other parts of the world. So exports don't necessarily generate jobs in the United States, but they do generate jobs in China.
So what do you think of the argument that I've heard from some of our colleagues here that if you were to hypothesize about an unexpected vulnerability in the U.S.-China equation over the next 10 or 15 years, it might be that, in fact, China's export industries are overbuilt for global demand, and that because what you say is true, that internal demand is going to be slower to rise than many people would like, that this could actually create a structural crisis in China, albeit a temporary one, if not as severe as ours, at least severe.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the experience of the past 20 years of China's export sector growing, you have had this commensurate growth of domestic demand. Not really that confusing, right? People start making more money, and they start doing what people do when they start making more money, which is they start first wanting to buy homes and refrigerators and scooters, and then they want to buy cars and computers and furniture and cell phones, and there are now 600 million cell phone users in China, and they replace their cell phones every 2 or 3 months, and more computers. And you may not. I mean, there's a whole critique of this: is this a sustainable model environmentally? I mean, if China had 1/5 the car penetration that the United States does, is that tenable for the global supply of oil? Is it tenable for the global supply of steel? Those, I think, are much more of the challenge going forward, which is if China even grows half the degree to which it's growing with domestic consumption than they want or than we think, are there enough global resources to absorb that? And that's not even taking into account, well, what if India suddenly, joins the party at an industrial level more than it already does?
So, but you think there's enough demand to justify the structure of Chinese export industries?
Well, I think if you continue to have the path that you've had for the past 20 years, which is there are still 4 billion people on this planet that are essentially outside what we would call the trade consumer economy. If China is built to sell to 300 million really affluent and another 2 billion join the party, as it were, maybe at a lesser level, then China's demand is not going to be, China's supply is not going to be sufficient to meet that kind of global demand. It's not just the U.S. So I think you can actually, I think it's more credible to look on the other side of that concern, which is that China will be saturated in its demand for stuff, long past the resource base will allow for that.
Somebody in the back there with his hand up on the left side. He was first in line here.
Hi, my name is Malik Rashid. I'm a consultant. You mentioned two pathways of where the U.S.-China relationship could evolve. One is the Britain-France model post-1945, and the other one is Britain-U.S. model post-1945. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is a possibility of neither happening? And I raised this question because the debate today about rise of China is a bit reminiscent of the rise of Japan debates that happened at the end of the 80s, early 90s. Of course, in hindsight, even with all that was happening in the U.S. at that time, Chrysler bailouts, S&L crisis, and the Gulf War in 1991, and Japan possibly taking over the U.S. They were buying Rockefeller Center and various precious assets in New York. The reality in the 90s turned out to be entirely different. Just wanted to see, given the, some parallels between what is happening now between U.S. and China vis-a-vis what has happened between U.S. and Japan, 20 years ago, just wanted to hear your viewpoints on that.
I mean, it's a totally viable question, and it understandably comes up whenever this conversation comes up. Personally, I think the chances of China following a Japan pathway are almost nil. Which doesn't mean that I think there aren't other pathways than the two we've discussed here. I mean, inherently the future is both uncertain and unknowable, and so anybody who claims great certainty about future outcomes is either lying to you or lying to themselves. We're all just kind of guesstimating likely scenarios based on our current read of the present and some continually evolving interpretations of the past. But it does strike me that the China story internally is different in substantive ways, or sufficiently different in substantive ways, from the Japan story as to lead me at least, to downplay that past analogy as a likely script for the future. One is just the sheer size of China's internal market, both in terms of population and complexity. The other is the degree to which it's a more complicated internal story. I mean, Steve alluded before to the non-monolithic nature of China, which I think is actually much more, we could talk much more about, but is quite real, whereas Japan's economy was actually very monolithic, fused both business and government in a particularly non-porous way. And weirdly enough, Japan was never as open to global commerce, even though it was pseudo-democratic and yen was convertible, as China is, even with the non-convertibility of its currency and an autocratic government. China arguably is a lot more porous to global capital and global business than India is today, which is quite democratic, but definitely difficult to have foreign people do business in. So I'm not as concerned about the Japan analogy. On the, are there other pathways here? Absolutely. And I wouldn't in any way say that you couldn't imagine them. But big systems, like battleships, right, don't turn on a dime. History sometimes does turn on a dime, but it's difficult under current conditions to see what would lead to a dramatic collapse of this particular system in China in the next 5 years. Simply because of the wealth creation and the fact that so many people in China feel like their society is moving forward, which serves as a real cohesive glue. I think the challenge for China is going to be more in the next 15 years when a generation that's born today or was born in the past 10 years grows into adulthood and grows up in this world where they take for granted a lot of the somewhat more material affluence, somewhat greater social stability, and whether or not they're satisfied with the world they're living in. And contrarily for the United States, I think our challenges are real and are not just a function of a year of difficulty, but have been building in many ways over the past 15 or 20 years, of which this recent year is simply laying bare some of those structural challenges that are not going to go away, and nor are there, in my mind, current signs either in the political realm or in the economic realm that they're about to go away, although that too is subject to great change at any given moment.
Coming down to the last 15 minutes, so let me collect a couple of questions. I know I've got two in the front. Let's get this gentleman leaning out there in the middle of this row. We'll come up front and take a final batch of questions.
Thank you. Martin Klings of the German weekly Die Zeit. I have a question. about the obstacles, and what do you think about the problems that concern climate change and the Iran question? Could there be major obstacles to the U.S.-China relation? And didn't Pittsburgh and even the G20 summit in London show that the G2 cannot replace G20?
On the climate change, I think some of the most interesting interaction between China and the United States right now is going on about climate change, about carbon emissions, and about what are largely behind-the-scenes discussions between energy and commerce officials in both countries. Partly as a way of recognizing that the upcoming climate summit in Copenhagen in December is, A, not likely to achieve a replacement of Kyoto, meaning there's not likely to be enough agreement. It's far more likely that what's going to happen in Copenhagen is what's happened in every single World Trade Organization attempt to renegotiate or move the needle, which is nothing. But that a lot can happen between the two based on self-interest. I agree that the G2 can't replace the G20, and in fact, the stability of the system depends on kind of ripples of activity throughout the world. But it's certainly true that concord between the U.S. and Chinese governments and integration between the U.S. and Chinese economies will have a greater determining factor on the stability and outcome than, let's say, concord between India and Brazil will, which is not to say that that's also not vital and important. But I do think the climate question is really an area that's proving to be much more fruitful and much more interesting than either the headlines suggest or may ever suggest. Questions around Iran, it's more like, this is an issue that matters greatly to the United States and hardly at all to China. That's not a recipe for conflict. So, if anything, the Beijing government is likely to kind of nod and be, I suppose, slightly pleased. You always want your potential adversary to be consumed in a fight that you think they cannot win, that will expend their energies in ways that will ultimately accrue to your advantage. So, on that front, I don't see that as a source of tension, mostly because I think Beijing just doesn't care.
So, as an author, I want to make sure you have plenty of time to sell books and to sign books. So let's just collect.
This whole thing has been about
selling
books.
Well, signing is also satisfying.
No, it hasn't been.
Yes.
I was saying that to Steve.
So let's just collect a couple of questions in the front here, 1, 2, 3, and then those of you who haven't had a chance to ask can ask him at the table as you purchase his book.
Maybe we can do one more. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, hi. I'm Bob Dreyfus. I write for Rolling Stone and The Nation. My question is about energy. If you could say something about the projections over the next 10 or 20 years of China's imports and requirements and where's it going to come from. And in that context, then, do you see it more likely that there would be a U.S.-China conflict, let's say, in the Middle East, Persian Gulf, et cetera, or that there would be some kind of condominium approach where the two countries would work together to stabilize the region? I mean, there's a story in the Wall Street Journal today, I think it's there, that says the U.S. is encouraging the Arabs to sell more oil to China so they don't have to depend on Iran and so forth. I mean, where do you see this going in a geopolitical sense?
Let's take one more and then I'll get to that.
Yes, this next door neighbor.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Schott. I am independent journalist working for Latin America media. The trade exchange between China and Latin America has increased over the last years. I would like to know, do you see that China could become more influential in the region as the U.S.? I would like to hear a U.S. perception on that. Thank you.
Actually, let me take those two together.
Yes.
We can probably go for another 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay.
Because they're interestingly linked. I mean, a lot of China's foreign policy for the past 4 or 5 years has been dedicated to securing supplies of vital industrial inputs, oil, iron ore, copper, that bypasses either the Middle East or American control, perceived control. And so you've had a lot of forays into Latin America. You've had a lot of forays into Africa, many of which have the scenes of leaders and governments that are less than friendly with the United States having warm embraces with Hu Jintao. It's kind of the axis of the unloved. And so that's been a very clear part of Chinese foreign policy, to secure access to the very kinds of resources that Robert Dreyfus just talked about. And it is clearly true that when you project China's, it's a little bit difficult, right? Because China is not at an energy level oil intensive. At an energy level, China's coal intensive, and then the rest is really supplied by hydroelectric and a minimal amount of wind and nuclear. Almost all of its petroleum goes into cars and for a while into diesel generators, because when there was a problem with the Chinese power grid, diesel was used for individual generators to compensate for the absence of it. But China's oil usage is going up dramatically as its numbers of trucks and its numbers of cars increases. And certainly, the growth there is right at the level of 10 to 20% a year, even though OPEC and the International Energy Commission was probably projecting China's oil usage to go up in a formulaic fashion commensurate with their GDP growth. And that's been wrong. I mean, China's oil usage has gone up much more than their GDP growth because their car and truck, and that's the problem of all these figures. It sort of takes the average over the past 50 years and says, well, because it's gone up this much, it'll go up that much. As to whether or not it's a source of tension with the U.S., I don't think in a direct sense it is, because the resources are a little bit fungible, and the oil market is global. The problem is the price point creating tension, and that's where, by the way, I do think the China challenge is going to be significant going forward, which is that if China's demand even meets what current projections are, it will exceed what the current supply is globally for these industrial inputs. Oil maybe a little less, so there's a little more, flexibility in the international oil market, although Steve would say, having been to Nigeria, some of that flexibility is probably assumed rather than actual. And that as rising prices put negative pressure on living standards, particularly in countries that will not subsidize it as much, that it's easy then to say, well, look, the problem here is not our price of copper or our price of industrial metals or our price of oil. It's because China's, consuming global supply. And I don't know what exactly the outcome of that will be. I mean, I think we will return to the $145 barrel of oil scenario, copper going up twice what it currently is in the next 3 to 5 years. And that's going to have all sorts of unforeseen consequences, one of which may in fact be somewhat greater tension between China and the U.S.
You have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Anybody have
We
a
have
question?
another
There was a
couple.
hand there in the back that was waiting its turn. Just wait for the microphone.
Anthony Kalinowski. I plan to start publishing on major issues very, very soon. The United States always was known for implementing new ideas, innovative ideas. We have stopped that as a result, direct result, I feel, of the last administration. We are bankrupt right now. My question is, okay, China is getting into high tech for sales. A small electric-powered airplane, ultralight, to be sold in this country for $80,000, developed short notice. Coal cleaning technology to be sold to us. Hydrogen-powered car now on the streets in Beijing, and other high-tech windmills, giant windmills. They are in the new energy sales area that we ignored because of the last administration. Where is the decision-making to implement these new, spending, researching, and developing these new technologies?
It's a really important question, and part of the problem is, of course, China may be a much more complicated internal society, but it is also true that when the Chinese government at a central level decides to do something, the friction between that decision and implementation is substantially less than anything that occurs here. The trade-off is, of course, you can't say anything in public about your government. So it's not a trade-off that we can in any way emulate. I'm just saying it's a reality. And having decided that because of the issues you talked about energy and future energy, that China needs to have more alternate sources of energy, they're going to spend billions of dollars on R&D and hundreds of billions of dollars on the infrastructure to develop it. We can say up the wazoo, we think we should be more green, we want to be more green, we ought to allocate capital in a way that encourages innovation. But we don't have a centralized national resource allocation council that can just say, okay, $200 billion of the stimulus is going to go directly toward windmill technology or to T. Boone Pickens. And it creates it is a competitive disadvantage. The only way that we can meet that is this kind of lovely homily of we should have more innovation, we should have more research and development funds, we should spend more money on our competitive advantage long term, which is great, and we should. But we also have a political system and an economic system that is unable to act commensurate with either that urgency or that homily, which is one of the reasons why I'm troubled by the future here, because I can identify that, but I don't have the perfect answer to that any more than anyone else does. And it's certainly true that China, acting in its own self-interest, is able to allocate that capital in those directions somewhat more than we're able to.
Great.
On that really hopeful and cheery note. By the way, just on a more, I do think for the time being that this system is constructive. And I argue, I think, somewhat coherently, that it is a constructive fusion in that the absence of it would have been significantly worse for the global system and would continue to be worse for the global system than its presence. That's a bias. It's one that people are going to disagree with. But I think that the fusion of systems and the creation of global wealth is on a net positive for the world and to some degree for American society. Whether it's a net positive for American power is a much more open question. And I'm not sure the United States needs to be as powerful for us to be as small p powerful or as affluent. And that's going to be the real challenge for the United States going forward.
Well, I think you can see in this conversation a lot of the strengths that you'll find in the book. It is more than somewhat coherent. And also, I think like a lot of one of the challenges with taking on a big idea in a book is the extent to which you impose the idea on the world or the extent to which you discover the idea through the world. And I think this is really a book, and this conversation shows that you've taken the second pathway, which is where the insight comes from. You've really worked out from a lot of complicated and confusing observations and synthesized them into something that's larger and directional and important. So congratulations for that. And thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you all for coming today.